There's a moment arriving before the sun has fully cleared the eastern ridgeline of the Black Hills of South Dakota, when the stone faces emerge from darkness the way memories surface from deep sleep, slowly, with weight, with a gravity that seems to belong not to the present moment, but to some longer, older conversation that humanity has been having with itself about who it is and what it values and what it chooses to remember. The sky behind them begins to lighten, first the deep navy blue of late night softening toward the purple of approaching dawn. The pine-covered hills surrounding the memorial are still dark, their silhouettes black against the brightening horizon. And then the faces begin to appear, not all at once, but gradually, one feature at a time, the way a photograph develops in a dark-room tray, the image emerging from blankness into resolution. The nose of George Washington catches the first light. It projects furthest from the stone face, that proud Roman nose, catching the earliest horizontal rays of morning sun, while the rest of the face remains in shadow. Then the forehead, broad and strong, begins to glow with the pale gold of early light. The eyes, those deep carved eyes that seem to see across centuries, remain in shadow a moment longer, giving Washington's emerging face an expression of intense contemplation that somehow suits the man who carried the weight of a new nation's birth. Beside him, Thomas Jefferson's face resolves from the darkness, the delicate curl of hair above his forehead catching light, his expression one of thoughtful intelligence, of ideas held carefully behind lips that seem almost on the verge of speaking. And then Abraham Lincoln, whose cavernous features and deep-set eyes seem made for shadow, for the weight of sorrow that defined his years in office, emerges with a gravitas that makes you want to lower your voice. And finally, Theodore Roosevelt, the most dynamically positioned of the four, with those round spectacles and the suggestion of a mustache, looking outward with an energy that is different in character from his companions, more forward-leaning, more impatient. In these first minutes of morning light, before the parking lots fill and the tour buses arrive, and the ambient sound of thousands of visitors creates the gentle roar that will fill this valley through the day, Mount Rushmore exists in something close to the form Gutzon Borglum imagined it. Not a tourist attraction, not a political statement, not a controversy, but something older and stranger and more elemental than any of those things. It is a mountain that has been made to speak, stone shaped into faces, faces shaped into meaning, meaning shaped by a particular moment in history when an ambitious sculptor and an ambitious nation found each other and decided, together, to do something that had never been done before on this scale, in this medium, in this place. To carve memory into granite, to make permanence from a political ideal, to ask a mountain to hold a story for 10,000 years. The scale is the first thing that defeats ordinary comprehension. Photographs do not prepare you for it. The face of George Washington alone is 60 feet tall, a measurement that means very little until you stand before it and try to relate it to the scale of your own body, your own face, your own small human presence at the base of this granite mountain. If Washington were rendered as a full standing figure at the same scale, he would stand 460 feet tall, taller than the Statue of Liberty from base to torch. Each face was carved from a specific kind of granite, the Harney Peak granite of the Black Hills, a stone that geologists date to approximately 1.6 billion years of age. This number is worth sitting with for a moment. The stone that holds these four presidential faces, this stone that Gutzon Borglum and his workers drilled and blasted and chiseled and polished between 1927 and 1941, has existed since long before any complex life existed on Earth. The trilobites that would one day leave their fossils in nearby sedimentary layers had not yet evolved. The seas that would lay down the rock layers of the Grand Canyon had not yet formed. The dinosaurs were still hundreds of millions of years in the future. This stone was already ancient when the first humans crossed from Asia into North America. It was ancient when the ancestors of the Lakota Sioux first looked upon these hills and recognized in them something sacred. It was ancient when European explorers first penetrated into the interior of the continent and note back to their governments about the extraordinary landscape they had found. And it is ancient still, indifferent to human history, patient in the way that only stone can be patient, carrying now on its face 4 human portraits that the people who put them there hoped would last, like the stone itself, for something approaching eternity. The approach to the memorial, along Highway 244 that curves through the Pine Hills, offers a series of revealing views. The faces appear and disappear as the road curves, each new sighting slightly different from the last, a different angle, a different proportion of sky to stone. This approaching and revealing is itself part of the experience, a kind of preparation for the full encounter, a way the landscape has of building anticipation. And then the road curves one final time and the memorial is before you, the 4 faces looking out over the valley, over the parking structures and visitor facilities and souvenir shops that have grown up at their feet, looking beyond all of that toward the horizon, toward the rolling hills of western South Dakota, toward the wide open spaces of a continent that the men they portray shaped in ways still felt today. 2 million visitors come here every year, arriving from every state in the nation and from countries around the world. They bring with them everything they know about these 4 presidents, everything they feel about America, everything they hope for and fear about democracy and history and the endurance of ideals across time. They come skeptical and they come reverent. They come as students and as pilgrims. They come as critics and as believers. And almost universally, they come away moved by something they don't entirely expect, the simple force of the thing itself, the sheer audacity of carving human faces into the side of a mountain, and the questions that audacity raises about memory, about heroism, about whose stories get told in stone. This is the story of those faces and of the mountain they inhabit and of all the human beings, complicated and brilliant and flawed and determined, who played a part in creating, inhabiting, and contesting this extraordinary place. Long before anyone imagined carving faces into them, long before the Black Hills had a name in any European language, these mountains existed as one of the most geologically remarkable landscapes on the North American continent. They rise from the surrounding plains of western South Dakota and northeastern Wyoming with a sudden drama, a wrinkled mass of ancient stone pushing up through younger sedimentary layers, creating an island of ancient rock in a sea of grassland. The name Black Hills comes from the Lakota Sioux description of the way the pine-covered mountains appear from a distance against the sky. Dark, forested, distinctly different in character from the lighter grass-covered plains surrounding them. To stand at the edge of the plains and look toward the Black Hills is to understand immediately why they would be distinctive to anyone who encountered them, rising as they do from flat surroundings, mysterious and dark and abundantly forested in a landscape that is otherwise open and windswept. The geological story of the Black Hills begins approximately 1.6 billion years ago when the granite that forms the core of the range crystallized deep beneath the surface of the Earth. This was the Precambrian era, an almost incomprehensibly ancient time when the North American continent was in the process of assembling itself from smaller pieces, the great tectonic forces that shape continents at work in slow motion over millions of years. The Harney Peak granite, named for the highest peak in the Black Hills and in all of the Great Plains region, formed when magma intruded into existing rock deep underground. The heat of this intrusion was tremendous, liquefying surrounding rock and mixing with it, but the intrusion itself remained largely liquid, cooling slowly over millions of years as it was insulated by the weight of rock above it. Slow cooling is the key to granite's characteristics. When magma cools slowly, the mineral crystals within it have time to grow large, creating a coarse-grained texture. The major minerals in Harney Peak granite are quartz, feldspar, and biotite mica, plus smaller amounts of other minerals. The proportions and arrangement of these minerals give the granite its characteristic pinkish-gray color, a color that changes dramatically with light conditions, appearing almost pink in the warm light of sunrise and sunset, silver-gray in overcast conditions, nearly white in midday summer sun. Over the vast time periods following the granite's crystallization, the overlying rock was gradually eroded away, the weight of centuries and millennia of weather stripping away the softer layers and eventually exposing the granite below. This process took hundreds of millions of years. The granite that was once buried under miles of rock now sits at or near the surface, exposed to the weather that has slowly begun the process of eroding it in turn. The Black Hills Dome, as geologists call the overall structure, is the result of a more recent geological event relative to the granite's age. Approximately 65 to 70 million years ago, around the time the dinosaurs were going extinct, tectonic forces began pushing the region upward, creating a dome of older rock surrounded by younger sedimentary layers. As erosion worked on this dome, it preferentially removed the softer sedimentary rocks from the top, eventually exposing the resistant granite core while leaving the sedimentary layers around the flanks. This creates the concentric ring structure visible in geological maps of the Black Hills. The granite core in the center, surrounded by rings of progressively younger sedimentary formations, each ring representing a different chapter in the geological story of the region. To drive from the surrounding plains into the Black Hills is to travel backward in time through these geological layers, moving through limestone, then sandstone, then shale, then limestone again, until you reach the granite core where Rushmore stands. The granite itself has characteristics that made it both appealing and challenging for Borglum's purposes. Its hardness is its primary virtue from a preservation standpoint. Granite is one of the most durable natural materials on Earth, resistant to weathering, chemically stable, capable of maintaining fine detail for geological time periods under the right conditions. The faces on Rushmore, assuming the memorial is maintained and the granite is not significantly fractured by geological events, could theoretically remain recognizable for hundreds of thousands of years. But the same hardness that makes granite durable makes it difficult to work. Traditional stone carving techniques used for softer materials like marble or limestone are inadequate for granite. To carve Rushmore required industrial tools and industrial quantities of explosive, the calculated application of force on a scale that had never before been attempted in the service of artistic expression. The Black Hills were known and sacred to multiple Native American peoples long before European exploration. The Lakota Sioux, who came to dominate the region in the 18th century after acquiring horses and driving out or absorbing earlier inhabitants, called the Black Hills Paha Sapa, the heart of everything that is. This name reflects the spiritual centrality of the hills to Lakota identity and cosmology. For the Lakota, the Black Hills were not simply a pleasant landscape or a useful resource, but a sacred geography, a place where the physical and spiritual worlds overlapped, where ceremonies were conducted, where the young went on vision quests, where the dead were honored. The hills provided wood, shelter, game, and water in a landscape that was otherwise more exposed and harsh. But their significance went beyond the practical. They were, in the deepest sense, home, not merely a place to live, but a place to be oneself, to connect to ancestry and to the spiritual dimension of existence. This sacred status made the Black Hills the center of a tragedy that would unfold through the 19th century, as Euro-American expansion drove the Lakota from lands they had occupied for generations and ultimately took from them even the Paha Sapa, the heart of everything that is. The The story of that dispossession and of Rushmore's memorial built on land that was taken in violation of treaty obligations is one that cannot be separated from the story of the mountain's carved faces. The Black Hills were guaranteed to the Lakota by the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, a legal agreement that established the Great Sioux Reservation and explicitly promised that the Black Hills would remain Lakota territory, closed to white settlement, protected forever from incursion. The treaty was signed by both parties with full legal authority. The United States government made a solemn promise. 6 years later, in 1874, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer led a military expedition into the Black Hills, ostensibly to survey for a potential military post. What the expedition found, and what Custer publicized with unfortunate enthusiasm in dispatches to the press, was gold. Within months of the announcement, gold seekers began pouring into the Black Hills in violation of the treaty. The government made nominal efforts to keep them out, but these efforts were half-hearted and ultimately unsuccessful. By 1875, it was clear that the United States government would not or could not honor its treaty obligations. The government's response was an attempt to purchase the Black Hills from the Lakota, but the Lakota refused to sell. The government then used the refusal of some Lakota groups to relocate to reservations as a pretext for military action, launching the Great Sioux War of 1876 and eventually forcing the Lakota onto greatly reduced reservation lands. The Black Hills were taken. The legal framework established by the Fort Laramie Treaty was simply ignored, the treaty violated by the very government that had signed it. The United States Supreme Court, in a 1980 decision, ruled that the taking of the Black Hills was illegal and awarded the Lakota Sioux Nation $105 million in compensation, a figure representing the original value of the land plus accrued interest. The Sioux Nation has refused to accept the money. They want the land, not payment for it. As of the time of this writing, the judgment sits uncollected, accruing interest, while the legal and moral questions remain unresolved. Into this landscape, onto this sacred and contested ground, Gutzon Borglum brought his vision of 4 presidential faces carved into granite. The stone of the Black Hills would bear new faces, American faces, presidential faces carved into the ancient rock that the Lakota had always considered theirs. The geological story, the sacred story, and the political story would come together at this particular mountain, creating a monument that is simultaneously a remarkable human achievement, a powerful national symbol, and a painful reminder of history's injustices. Gutzon Borglum was a man of not modest ambitions. He was, by most accounts, difficult, brilliant, egotistical, visionary, quarrelsome, and possessed of an unshakable conviction that he was destined to create works of art that would outlast civilization itself. These qualities, which made him difficult to work with and occasionally impossible to like, were precisely the qualities needed to push through a project as audacious and logistically challenging as Rushmore. Born in 1867 in Charles, Idaho, John Gutzon de la Mothe Borglum was the son of Danish immigrants, the second of the 2 sons his father fathered with the same mother, his mother and his sister having both been married to the same man under a plural marriage arrangement that Borglum would later obscure and complicate in various autobiographical accounts. His was a complicated beginning, his origins entangled with the particular social arrangements of frontier Mormon communities, and Borglum would spend much of his life constructing and reconstructing the narrative of himself, emphasizing some things and minimizing others, a sculptor not just of stone, but of identity. He showed artistic ability early and was sent by his father to California to study, eventually traveling to Europe for formal training in Paris, where he spent years immersed in the world of 19th-century French academic sculpture. He worked in the studios of Auguste Rodin, one of the transformative figures of Western sculpture, and absorbed from Rodin an approach to the human form that emphasized psychological depth and emotional truth over classical perfection. Borglum returned to the United States a trained and ambitious sculptor, determined to create work on a scale worthy of what he saw as the exceptional nature of the American experience. He believed, with the romantic nationalism of his era, that America was a new kind of civilization, uniquely important in human history, deserving of monuments that reflected that uniqueness. He looked at the existing commemorative landscape of the country, the statues in parks, the busts in Capitol buildings, the friezes on public buildings, and found them inadequate, too small, too European in conception, too concerned with aesthetic refinement, and not enough with scale and impact, and the kind of grandeur that the American landscape itself embodied. His first large project of note was a carving in Stone Mountain, Georgia, where he was commissioned to create a massive relief carving of Confederate leaders on the face of a granite mountain. Borglum worked on Stone Mountain from 1916 to 1925, developing the techniques he would later apply at Rushmore: the use of dynamite for rough shaping, the pneumatic drills for intermediate work, the handheld tools for finishing. He also developed the pointing machine technique that allowed him to transfer small models to the face of the mountain with mathematical precision, scaling up his studio work to the vast dimensions required. His departure from Stone Mountain was characteristically dramatic. A dispute with the Stone Mountain Confederate Memorial Association over finances and creative control ended with Borglum smashing his models and fleeing the state under threat of arrest. The acrimony was extreme, the accusations flew in both directions, and Borglum found himself in need of a new project. That new project would come from South Dakota, from a historian and promoter named Doane Robinson, who had an idea about using the Black Hills to attract tourists. Robinson's original concept was relatively modest. He envisioned carving figures of frontier heroes, Lakota leaders, and historical characters significant to the American West into the Needle Rock formations of the Custer State Park area. He imagined something picturesque and regional, a tourist attraction that would put South Dakota on the map. Robinson reached out to Borglum in 1924, and Borglum was immediately interested, but immediately transformative. He saw in Robinson's idea something much larger than Robinson had conceived. He saw an opportunity to create the massive, nationally significant work he had always dreamed of, a monument not to regional figures, but to the nation itself, to the presidents who had shaped it, carved not into soft needle formations, but into solid granite, built to last not centuries, but geological ages. Borglum visited the Black Hills in 1925 and selected Mount Rushmore as his site. The mountain, known to the Lakota as the Six Grandfathers and renamed Mount Rushmore after New York lawyer Charles E. Rushmore, who had visited the area in 1885, offered what Borglum needed. It faced southeast toward the sun, meaning the faces would be fully illuminated throughout most of the day. The granite was of sufficient hardness and homogeneity for fine carving. The mountain was of sufficient height to allow 60-foot faces to be carved without the images being distorted by extreme foreshortening. And it was visible from a distance, set slightly apart from surrounding peaks, a stage designed by nature for exactly the kind of performance Borglum had in mind. From this point forward, Borglum's personality, in all its contradictory fullness, would drive the project. He was the one who lobbied Congress for funding, who charmed and badgered successive presidential administrations, who made the creative decisions, who hired and fired workers, who managed the complex logistics of the construction. He was also the one who feuded with the Memorial Commission, who spent money in ways that alarmed his financial overseers, who periodically threatened to quit when he felt his artistic vision was being compromised. His personal beliefs were sometimes troubling. He had associations with the Ku Klux Klan during the 1920s, connections that were complex and that historians continue to debate in terms of their depth and significance. He held the racial attitudes common to many Americans of his class and era,
attitudes that seem to us now deeply wrong, and that are part of the complicated legacy of a man whose greatest work stands as a celebration of American democratic ideals. Borglum was also a devoted father, a generous employer when his finances allowed, a man who formed genuine bonds of loyalty with the workers who risked their lives on the mountain face. He was brilliant and intuitive as a sculptor, capable of making decisions about form and proportion that worked perfectly at 60 feet, even when they seemed counterintuitive at smaller scales. He was a tireless promoter, a man who understood that in a democracy, even the greatest artistic project required political support, public enthusiasm, and the kind of constant publicity that kept attention and funding flowing. He died on March 6, 1941, before the final completion of the work, following complications from surgery. He died knowing that the essential work was done, that the four faces were finished to a level he found acceptable, but also knowing that the grander vision he had held for the memorial, the Hall of Records, the detailed costuming of the figures, the inscription panel, would never be completed. He left behind him a work that would outlast not just his own life, but the civilization that created it, carved into stone that had existed for 1.6 billion years and would exist for billions more. This is what he wanted, this is what he achieved, and this is the complex, contradictory, magnificent legacy that his name carries in the history of American art. Before the first drill touched the mountain's face, before the first load of dynamite was placed in its carefully calculated borehole, the most important question had to be answered: which presidents? The choice of the four faces that would stare out from Mount Rushmore across the South Dakota plains for geological eternity was not made quickly or without controversy, and the decisions made reflect both the historical moment in which they were made and the enduring judgments of history about which leaders shaped the nation most profoundly. Doane Robinson's original proposal had not included presidents at all. He envisioned frontier heroes, Lewis and Clark, Buffalo Bill Cody, Oglala Lakota Chief Red Cloud, figures significant to the regional history and mythology of the American West. But when Borglum came aboard with his nationalizing vision, the project's scope transformed. This would not be a monument to the West, it would be a monument to America. The choice of presidents was Borglum's, guided by his own strong historical views and by his desire for figures whose national significance was uncontested enough to secure the congressional funding the project would require. He settled on four criteria. The presidents chosen must represent the founding of the nation, its early expansion and political development, its preservation through crisis, and its development into a world power. These criteria, though not formally stated after the choices were made, explain and justify each selection with varying degrees of persuasiveness. The selection process was intertwined with the political realities of the 1920s. Borglum needed congressional support, which meant choosing figures who would appeal broadly across partisan lines, who represented the nation's mythology broadly enough to avoid partisan objection. He also needed figures whose faces were sufficiently well known that their likenesses would be immediately recognizable, even at 60 feet in granite. Some choices were obvious from the beginning. George Washington was never seriously questioned. He was the founding president, the man who established the precedents by which the presidency itself functioned, the general who had won the Revolutionary War, the president who had voluntarily relinquished power, setting the two-term tradition that would guide American democracy for a century and a half. His face was the one that would occupy the most prominent position on the mountain, slightly separated from and above the others, the anchor of the entire composition.
Abraham Lincoln was similarly uncontroversial as a choice, though the depth of his presence as a symbol of national preservation perhaps understates his significance. He had held the nation together through its greatest internal crisis, had abolished slavery through the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, had articulated in the Gettysburg Address a vision of American democracy as a continuing experiment in human equality.
His assassination had made him a martyr, and martyrdom has a powerful effect on historical memory, burnishing legacies and silencing critics. Thomas Jefferson required more deliberation. His inclusion represented Borglum's desire to honor the Declaration of Independence, which Jefferson had primarily authored, and the Louisiana Purchase, which had doubled the size of the nation and enabled the Western expansion that was so central to American mythology. Jefferson's intellectual contributions to political philosophy, to the vision of an educated citizenry as the foundation of democratic government, were also factors. But even in the 1920s, Jefferson's legacy was complicated. He was a slaveholder who wrote that all men were created equal. He was an expansionist who saw the North American continent as properly the domain of Euro-American civilization, a vision that necessarily displaced and dispossessed the peoples already living there. These contradictions were not unknown in Borglum's time, though they received less critical attention than they do today. Borglum chose to honor Jefferson, the political philosopher and nation builder, while the contradictions remained in the background, unaddressed. The fourth choice was the most contested, and it remains the most debated of the four selections. Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th president, served from 1901 to 1909, meaning he had been dead for only a decade when carving of his likeness began on Mount Rushmore. He was the most recent of the four presidents by a very wide margin, and his inclusion over other candidates, Andrew Jackson, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, were all discussed, reflected Borglum's personal admiration for the man and his particular interpretation of what Roosevelt represented. Borglum justified Roosevelt's inclusion on the grounds of his role in completing the Panama Canal, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and making the United States a major commercial and naval power with a presence on two oceans simultaneously. He also cited Roosevelt's conservation legacy, his establishment of the national forest system, the national parks, the monuments and refuges that protected millions of acres of American wilderness from commercial exploitation. These justifications have been accepted by some historians and questioned by others. Roosevelt's inclusion over presidents with longer historical perspectives, John Adams, James Madison, James Monroe, reflects Borglum's personal enthusiasm as much as historical consensus. Borglum had met Roosevelt, admired him enormously, and saw in the Rough Rider president a model of American manhood and national character that resonated with Borglum's own romanticized vision of the country. The positioning of the four faces on the mountain was itself a significant artistic and symbolic decision. Washington occupies the leftmost position from the viewer's perspective, the most prominent, furthest forward in the composition. Jefferson is positioned to Washington's right, slightly recessed. Roosevelt and Lincoln occupy the right side of the composition, with Lincoln being the furthest right and Roosevelt positioned between Jefferson and Lincoln. The original plan placed Jefferson to Washington's left, but early drilling revealed a flaw in the granite at that location, forcing a significant revision that required abandoning hundreds of thousands of dollars of already completed work. The facing Jefferson now visible was carved entirely fresh on the other side of Washington in what represented one of the most dramatic and costly course corrections in the project's history. The four faces together constitute a particular version of the American story, a story of founding, expansion, preservation, and global emergence. It is not the only version of that story that could have been told, and the silences in the composition, the absence of female presidents because there were none, the absence of presidents of color for the same historical reason, the absence of presidents whose legacies center on justice rather than expansion, say as much about American mythology as the presences. But within its own terms, within the historical moment that produced it, the selection has a logic and a coherence that has given it extraordinary staying power. 75 years after Borglum made his choices, those four faces still represent for millions of Americans and for countless international visitors something essential about the American experiment, about what the country has aspired to be at its best, about the leaders who shaped it most profoundly. George Washington looks out from the granite of Mount Rushmore with an expression that contains everything and nothing, the inscrutable dignity of a man who has seen too much to be surprised and who has carried too much to be visibly moved. It is a face that has been reproduced on the dollar bill and the quarter for so long that it risks becoming an abstraction, a symbol rather than a human presence. But on the mountain, at 60 feet, carved in stone that was old before humanity existed, it reasserts its humanity. He was born on February 22, 1932, in Westmoreland County, Virginia, the son of a Virginia planter family of modest but established prosperity. The story of his life has been told so many times that it risks becoming mythology. The cherry tree that never existed, the coin thrown across the Rappahannock River, the wooden teeth that were actually made of ivory and human teeth and various other materials. These myths, invented in the decades following his death, tell us more about what Americans wanted Washington to be than what he was. What he actually was is in many ways more interesting than the mythology. He was a land surveyor and a tobacco planter, a man of practical intelligence and extraordinary physical gifts. He was tall for his era, over 6 feet, with the physical presence and self-possession that made him a natural leader. He was not intellectually brilliant in the way Jefferson was brilliant, not a philosopher or a writer of great elegance, but he had a kind of intelligence that is perhaps rarer and practically more valuable, the ability to judge character, to inspire loyalty, to maintain strategic clarity in situations of extreme stress. His military record before the Revolution was mixed but formative. He served as a Virginia militia officer during the French and Indian War, made significant mistakes, showed moments of remarkable personal courage, and emerged from the experience with a pragmatic understanding of warfare that would serve him well when commanding larger forces. He also emerged with grievances against the British military establishment that had treated colonial officers as inferior, a personal experience of imperial condescension that likely informed his later political transformation. As commander of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War, Washington's greatness manifested not in any particular military brilliance, but in something more difficult and more important, the ability to hold together an army and a coalition through years of defeat, deprivation, political interference, and seemingly impossible odds. He lost more battles than he won. His tactical decisions were sometimes questionable, but he understood that the revolution could not be won by destroying the British Army. It could only be won by making the cost of continued war unacceptable to the British public, by keeping the Continental Army in the field, by maintaining the coalition, by outlasting rather than defeating the enemy. This kind of patient, long-term strategic thinking is a rare quality, and Washington possessed it in abundance. He also possessed the political intelligence to navigate the extraordinary complexities of commanding an army for a government that had no power to compel compliance from the states, no ability to levy taxes directly, and itself was riven by factional disputes. That Washington managed to hold this coalition together long enough to win the war represents one of the most significant personal achievements in American history.
His greatest act, the one that perhaps most fully justifies his place on the mountain, came after the victory. When the war was over and Washington was at the height of his military prestige and power, there was significant discussion among some of his officers about the possibility of using the army to establish a monarchy with Washington as king. Washington was not simply uninterested in this possibility, he was actively offended by it. He did not fight to replace one king with another. He believed in the Republican principles that had justified the Revolution. He relinquished command of the Continental Army in December 1783, returning his commission to the Congress in Annapolis in a ceremony so moving that it reportedly brought observers to tears. The greatest military figure in North America voluntarily surrendered his power to the civilian government he served. This act was recognized internationally, including by King George III himself, who reportedly said that if Washington walked away from power voluntarily, he was the greatest man in the world.
Washington's 2 terms as the first president established the framework within which all subsequent presidents have operated. He understood that everything he did set precedent, that future presidents would cite his example, and he governed with this awareness. He established the 2-term tradition, the cabinet system, the role of the president as both head of government and head of state, the importance of maintaining civilian control over the military in peacetime. These contributions, institutional rather than spectacular, are among the most enduring in American political history. His face on the mountain captures something of the man: the strong jaw, the prominent nose, the dignified bearing. Borglum worked from the famous Houdon bust, the most lifelike portrait made from direct observation of Washington's face, and from the many paintings that attempted to capture the president's appearance. The 60-foot stone face can only gesture toward the complexity of the man, but it gestures with remarkable authority. Washington's legacy is not without shadow. He was a slaveholder who benefited enormously from enslaved labor throughout his life, who managed his enslaved people with a businessman's calculation, who found ways to keep his own slaves from gaining freedom under Virginia law, even while professing discomfort with the institution. The contradiction between the man who founded a democracy and the man who held other human beings as property is one that cannot be resolved, only acknowledged with honesty about the gap between ideals and practice that characterized the founding generation. But it is also true that Washington, near the end of his life, moved toward a position that distinguished him from most of his slaveholding peers. His will provided for the freedom of all his enslaved people upon the death of his wife Martha. It provided for the care and education of the freed people. Whether this represented genuine moral evolution or pragmatic calculation is impossible to know for certain, but the provision itself was unusual among the founders. The Washington who looks out from Mount Rushmore is the Washington of the founding mythology, the man who built the republic and gave it its initial form. He is the necessary first face, the anchor of the composition, the president against whom all others are measured. His 60-foot stone visage surveys the Black Hills with an expression that might be read as confidence, or as responsibility, or as the complex awareness of a man who knew he was making history and felt the weight of that knowledge every day. Thomas Jefferson's place on Mount Rushmore is secured by 2 extraordinary achievements that between them define the philosophical and geographical foundations of the United States. The first is the Declaration of Independence, which he drafted in 1776 at the age of 33, and which remains the most eloquent and influential statement of democratic political philosophy produced by the American founding generation. The second is the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, which doubled the size of the young nation and opened the continental interior to the expansion that would define American history through the 19th century. Jefferson was born on April 13, 1743, at Shadwell Plantation in Goochland County, Virginia. He was the product of the Virginia planter aristocracy, educated at the College of William and Mary, trained as a lawyer, and possessed of an intellectual curiosity that was genuinely extraordinary, even in an era that produced an unusual concentration of brilliant minds. He read voraciously across every field of knowledge available to him: natural history, architecture, music, mathematics, philosophy, literature, languages. He taught himself Italian to read Palladio in the original. He designed his own house, Monticello, in a Palladian style that reflected his architectural studies, rebuilding it repeatedly as he continued to learn and refine his ideas. He collected wines, fossils, botanical specimens, books. When he died, his library became the nucleus of the Library of Congress. The Declaration of Independence was not entirely Jefferson's creation. It drew on ideas that had been circulating in the Anglo-American political tradition for decades, ideas about natural rights and the social contract and the proper limits of governmental authority that can be traced through John Locke and the English radical tradition back further still. Jefferson himself acknowledged that he was expressing the common sense of the subject rather than inventing new ideas. But what he did with these ideas, the way he shaped them into prose of such clarity and force that they still function today as a direct argument to be reckoned with, is an act of literary genius. The phrase, "all men are created equal," is perhaps the most contested sentence in American history, its implications debated, its scope disputed, its application struggled over across 2.5 centuries, but its power as a statement of aspiration and a standard against which American practice can be measured has never diminished. The Declaration's opening paragraphs are among the most analyzed and most quoted passages in the English language, but they repay rereading with fresh attention. Jefferson was making an argument, not a proclamation. He was reasoning from premises through to a conclusion, using the tools of Enlightenment philosophy to justify an act of political revolution. The elegance of the reasoning, the precision of the language, the controlled rhetorical elevation of the prose, these qualities made the document not just a political statement, but a literary artifact of the first order. Jefferson's presidency from 1801 to 1809 produced the Louisiana Purchase as its most lasting achievement. The territory, acquired from France for approximately $15 million, encompassed some 828,000 square miles of land west of the Mississippi River. The purchase was constitutionally questionable, and Jefferson knew it. He couldn't find clear authority in the Constitution for the executive branch to acquire territory, but he concluded that the national interest overrode the constitutional scruple, completed the purchase, and sent Lewis and Clark west to explore the new territory. The Louisiana Purchase is central to Borglum's justification for Jefferson's place on the mountain, and it is indeed a massive achievement in geopolitical terms. It secured American control of the Mississippi River and its vital commercial role, eliminated the threat of a powerful European presence on America's western border, and opened the interior of the continent to the expansion that became a defining feature of American life through the 19th century. But that expansion came at a cost borne entirely by the peoples already living in the acquired territory, peoples who were not consulted about the purchase of their homelands and whose presence was treated as an obstacle to be removed rather than a civilization to be respected. The Louisiana Purchase that enabled American continental expansion simultaneously set in motion the processes of removal, displacement, and destruction that would devastate Native American peoples throughout the 19th century.
Jefferson himself held complex and evolving views on Native Americans, at times expressing respect for indigenous cultures and peoples, while simultaneously developing and implementing policies of removal and cultural destruction. His vision for the expansion enabled by the Louisiana Purchase was explicitly a vision of agricultural settlement by Euro-American farmers, not a vision that left room for the continuation of indigenous ways of life. Jefferson's slaveholding represents the same painful contradiction present in Washington's biography, but in Jefferson's case, the contradiction is sharpened by the very universalism of the Declaration he wrote. He knew that all men are created equal did not match the reality of enslaved people held on his own plantation. He wrote about slavery as a moral wrong. "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just," while making no move to free his own enslaved people during his lifetime and freeing only a handful in his will. He fathered children with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman who could not consent to the relationship by any meaningful definition of the term, a reality that Jefferson's defenders long denied, but that DNA evidence has now established beyond reasonable doubt. These contradictions do not erase Jefferson's achievements, but they demand that his legacy be understood in full, not sanitized into a simple story of great ideas and great men. The Jefferson on Mount Rushmore is the Jefferson of the Declaration and the Louisiana Purchase, the philosopher-president who expanded both the nation's territory and its political vocabulary.
The full Jefferson is more complex, more human, more deeply implicated in the nation's original sins, and that fuller understanding enriches rather than diminishes the significance of what he accomplished. Jefferson's face on the mountain is perhaps the most delicate of the four, the features finer and more precisely rendered than the others, suggesting the intellectual refinement that characterized the man. The slight upward tilt of his chin, the refined brow, the suggestion of a smile. These elements combine to create an impression of intelligence and confidence, of a man comfortable with ideas, assured of his own ability to think through any problem and find a solution. Abraham Lincoln's face on Mount Rushmore carries a different quality than the others. There is a weight to it, a depth in the carved eyes that seems to hold not just thought, but sorrow, not just intelligence, but the particular exhaustion of a man who has carried the suffering of a nation through its most terrible years. Borglum captured something in that face that goes beyond mere portraiture, something that speaks to the specific gravity of Lincoln's historical moment and the specific nature of Lincoln's response to it. He was born on February 12, 1809, in a log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky, to parents who were subsistence farmers on the frontier. His childhood was one of grinding poverty and hard physical labor, of sporadic schooling and self-education, of the kind of formative difficulty that either breaks a person or makes them. Lincoln was not broken. He read everything he could find. He taught himself law from borrowed copies of Blackstone's commentaries. He worked as a farmhand, a flatboatman, a store clerk, a surveyor, a postmaster, before finding his path to the law and then to politics. His physical appearance was distinctive, even striking. 6 feet 4 inches tall, with an elongated, angular face and large hands, a body shaped by years of frontier labor. He was not considered handsome by the standards of his time, and he acknowledged this freely, including famous stories about his own plainness that he told with characteristic, self-deprecating humor. But he had a physical presence, a commanding quality that photographs only partially capture. Lincoln's intellectual gifts were primarily rhetorical and analytical. He was not a systematic thinker in the philosophical tradition, not a reader of political theory, not someone who had absorbed the classical education of men like Jefferson and Madison. But he had a mind of extraordinary clarity and an ability to express complex ideas in simple, memorable language that was uniquely his. The Gettysburg Address is 272 words long. In those words, Lincoln redefined the meaning of the Civil War, reinterpreted the founding documents to include a commitment to equality that the founders had gestured toward but not fully embraced, and articulated a vision of American democracy as a continuing moral experiment whose success was not guaranteed but was worth fighting and dying for. His path to the presidency ran through the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858, a series of 7 debates in the Illinois Senate race that were attended by thousands and followed by millions through newspaper transcripts. Though Lincoln lost the Senate race, the debates made him nationally famous and positioned him for the 1860 Republican presidential nomination. He won that nomination on the 3rd ballot and won the general election in a 4-way race that gave him only about 40% of the popular vote, but enough electoral college votes for a decisive victory. His election triggered the secession crisis that he had spent his political career trying to prevent. South Carolina seceded before he was even inaugurated. 6 more states followed by the time he took office on March 4, 1861. The Confederate States of America had been formed, with Jefferson Davis as its president. Lincoln inherited a nation already breaking apart, an army too small to fight a major war, a treasury depleted by his predecessors' inaction, and a cabinet of rivals who each thought they were better qualified for the presidency than he was. What Lincoln understood with absolute clarity, and what shaped every decision of his presidency, was that the Union could not be allowed to fail. Not for sentimental or nostalgic reasons, but because the failure of the American democratic experiment would validate the claims of those throughout the world that democracy was inherently unstable, that popular government could not sustain itself through crisis. The survival of American democracy, in Lincoln's understanding, was a matter of global significance, a test case for the viability of self-government that the whole world was watching. The Civil War that followed his inauguration was unlike any previous American conflict in scale and in cost. Over 4 years, some 620,000 to 750,000 soldiers died, a number that exceeded the American death toll of all other wars combined until the Vietnam era. Towns and cities were burned, agricultural economies were destroyed, families were divided, with brothers literally fighting brothers across the lines of the two armies. Lincoln led through this war with a combination of political cunning, moral seriousness, and pragmatic flexibility that have made him the subject of continuous historical fascination. He made terrible mistakes. He suspended habeas corpus, infringing civil liberties in ways that were constitutionally questionable. He removed and replaced generals with sometimes maddening frequency, before finding Ulysses S. Grant, the general who would finally give him the military leadership he needed. He made political calculations that disappointed abolitionists who wanted faster action on slavery. But he grew, publicly, as a moral thinker. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, issued on the grounds of military necessity but representing a genuine moral commitment, transformed the war's purpose from a war to preserve the Union into a war to end slavery. The second inaugural address, delivered on March 4, 1865, with the war nearly won, is perhaps the finest piece of political prose in the American canon, a meditation on the meaning of the war, on the complicity of both North and South in the sin of slavery, on the need for Reconstruction to proceed with malice to none and charity for all. He was shot at Ford's Theater on the night of April 14, 1865, 5 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, and died the following morning. The nation he died in was still scarred and divided, but it was a nation. The experiment in democratic governance had survived its greatest internal test, and Lincoln had been its steward through that test, the person most responsible for the survival of the Union and the abolition of the institution that had threatened to destroy it. Borglum's rendering of Lincoln's face captures the melancholy dignity that contemporaries described in the man. The deep-set eyes, the heavy brow, the prominent nose and cheekbones. These features, so distinctive in the photographs that are among the most studied faces in American history, translate remarkably well to the scale and medium of carved granite. Lincoln's face on the mountain has a quality.
Of the 4 faces on Mount Rushmore, Theodore Roosevelt's is in some ways the most surprising choice and the most personally revealing of Gutzon Borglum's own values and perspectives. Roosevelt was not yet a generation removed from the time of carving. Historians had not yet had the time and distance needed to assess his legacy with the consensus that attached to the other 3. His inclusion over candidates with stronger claims of historical distance and proven legacy reflects Borglum's personal enthusiasm for Roosevelt as a particular type of American man. Born on October 27, 1858, in New York City to an aristocratic family,
Theodore Roosevelt was the product of wealth and privilege who transformed himself, through will and discipline, into the embodiment of what he called the strenuous life. As a child, he suffered severe asthma and was small and weak. He could have accepted these limitations as defining. Instead, he fought them obsessively, building his body through exercise and outdoor activity, cultivating physical courage and endurance as values central to his identity. This transformation from sickly child to Rough Rider cavalry colonel, from indoor weakling to outdoorsman and big game hunter, from New York aristocrat to Dakota Territory cattle rancher, was not just biographical accident, but deliberate self-creation. Roosevelt believed that the character forged through physical challenge and outdoor experience was a necessary quality for national vitality, and he lived this belief with an intensity that impressed even those who found his particular enthusiasms excessive. He came to the presidency young, at 42, the youngest person ever to hold the office, following the assassination of William McKinley in September 1901. He served nearly 2 full terms, from 1901 to 1909, and his presidency was characterized by an activism and energy that contrasted sharply with the more reserved style of his predecessors. Roosevelt's conservation legacy is the most enduring element of his presidency and the one most clearly relevant to the spirit of Mount Rushmore, itself carved into the wilderness landscape of the American West. He established 150 national forests, 51 federal bird reserves, 4 national game preserves, 5 national parks, and 18 national monuments during his presidency. The total area protected through these actions amounted to approximately 230 million acres, the most significant addition to the public land estate in American history. This conservation work reflected both Roosevelt's personal passion for the natural world and a political philosophy that saw the nation's natural resources as a public trust to be managed for long-term national benefit rather than exploited for short-term private gain. He was not a pure preservationist. He believed in managed use of natural resources, in sustainable harvest of timber and the regulated grazing of public lands. But he also believed that some places, Yosemite, the Grand Canyon, the Olympic Peninsula, had values that transcended their extractive potential, values of beauty and wildness and spiritual restoration that justified protection from commercial development. His foreign policy legacy is more contested. The Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which asserted the United States' right to intervene in Latin American countries that failed to maintain order or meet their international obligations, established a pattern of interventionism that would shape American foreign policy for decades and create significant resentment throughout Latin America. His role in engineering Panamanian independence from Colombia in order to secure the canal rights that he needed for his Isthmian Canal project was an exercise in imperial power politics that disturbed even some of his supporters at the time. The Panama Canal, which Borglum cited as a primary justification for Roosevelt's inclusion on the mountain, was completed in 1914 under Woodrow Wilson, though the crucial work of securing the rights and beginning construction occurred under Roosevelt. The canal was an extraordinary engineering achievement that transformed global commerce and established American power in the Western Hemisphere in concrete and unmistakable terms. Whether it justifies Roosevelt's presence on Rushmore at the expense of presidents with longer historical perspectives is a question without a definitive answer. Roosevelt's face on the mountain, positioned between Jefferson and Lincoln, shows the round spectacles and strong mustache that were his most recognizable features. The spectacles were a particular challenge for Borglum: how to represent eyeglasses in granite without either losing the characteristic appearance or creating a visually distracting element in the composition. His solution was to represent only the rims without the glass, creating a visual shorthand that reads clearly from a distance while avoiding the reflective complexity actual glass would create. The expression captured in Roosevelt's stone face has an energy that distinguishes it from the more contemplative expressions of his companions. He looks forward rather than across, his chin set with the confidence of a man who believes in his own judgment and his own ability to get things done. It is the face of the activist, the reformer, the man who believed that power was to be used, not simply held. Roosevelt's legacy contains the same shadows and contradictions that mark the legacies of his predecessors on the mountain. His racial attitudes reflected the white supremacist assumptions common to men of his class and era, attitudes that shaped his policies on immigration, on colonial governance, on the treatment of indigenous peoples. His vigorous military imperialism brought Caribbean and Pacific nations into an American sphere of influence in ways that were not always benign or consensual. But within the framework Borglum established for the memorial, presidents who shaped the nation's expansion, preservation, and rise to world power, Roosevelt's claim is defensible. He transformed the presidency into an activist institution, established conservation as a national value, built American power in the hemisphere and the world, and embodied a vision of national vigor and engagement that captured the imagination of his era. Whether he belongs in the same permanent company as Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln is a question that each generation of Americans will answer for itself. The mountain has made its statement. The stone will hold it for geological ages. The debate continues, as it should, because a democracy that cannot debate the meaning of its own monuments has lost something essential to its identity. The question of how to carve faces into a mountain had never been answered at the scale Borglum proposed. The largest previous relief carvings in granite were much smaller, and the techniques used for softer stone were inadequate for the Harney Peak granite of the Black Hills. Borglum would have to invent, adapt, and improvise, developing a construction methodology as unique as the project itself. The fundamental technical challenge was precision at enormous scale. A sculptor carving a marble bust can work with fine tools from the beginning, creating detail through direct manipulation of the stone. At Rushmore, the faces were 60 feet tall. The scale required that rough work be done by removing large quantities of stone quickly and efficiently, with refinement coming later and the finest detailing coming last. Borglum's solution combined two technologies in unprecedented ways. The primary stone removal tool was dynamite, used not in the crude, massive blasts of road construction or mining, but in carefully calculated, precisely placed small charges designed to remove specific amounts of stone without fracturing the surrounding rock that would become the finished surface. Borglum developed a method of drilling patterns of holes at calculated depths, placing small charges in these holes and detonating them to create spalling, the breaking away of sheets of rock that removed material while leaving a relatively uniform surface. The placement of these holes and the calculation of charge sizes required engineering skill and artistic judgment. A charge too large would remove too much stone, potentially destroying a feature that was needed. A charge misplaced could fracture the stone in ways that would prevent fine finishing. Borglum's ability to visualize the finished face within the existing stone, to see what needed to be removed and what needed to remain, was the critical skill that made the dynamite work artistically productive rather than destructively random.
The drilling was exhausting, dangerous work. Workers hung in harnesses attached to cables anchored at the mountain's summit, swinging in the open air as they operated their drills against the granite face. The noise was tremendous. Dozens of drills operating simultaneously created a din that could be heard for miles. The stone dust was constant and pervasive, a health hazard that afflicted many of the workers, though the development of wet drilling techniques and ventilation systems reduced the worst impacts. For the finest work, the detailing that created the specific features of each president's face, the precise shape of an eyelid, the exact curve of a nostril, the subtle modeling around the mouth,
Borglum's most skilled workers used handheld tools, chisels of various shapes and weights, and a technique called bumping that involved using a drill to make a pattern of closely spaced small holes that were then connected to create a smooth surface. The system Borglum used to transfer his small studio models to the mountain face was adapted from the traditional sculptor's pointing machine, a device used since antiquity to copy three-dimensional forms at any scale. Borglum built a pointing machine that could reference a small plaster model of each face, typically at 1:12 scale, meaning each inch of the model corresponded to a foot on the mountain, and translate any specific point on the model to the corresponding point on the mountain face with mathematical precision. The system worked through a central hub mounted at the top of each face, from which measuring arms could be extended at calculated angles and distances to locate any point on the surface. Workers on the mountain used handheld versions of the pointing instrument, checking their work against calculations derived from the studio model, ensuring that the mountain face matched the artistic intent encoded in the model. This system required constant communication between Borglum in his studio and workers on the mountain face. He would make adjustments to the model as he saw how the work was progressing, sometimes changing his mind about proportions or expressions as the actual stone revealed its particular character. These changes would be reflected in new calculations and new instructions to the workers, creating an ongoing dialogue between studio conception and physical execution. The practical logistics of the construction were themselves enormous challenges. The mountain site required extensive infrastructure, roads to transport workers and materials, a compressor house for the pneumatic drills, a blacksmith shop to sharpen the steel drill bits that dulled rapidly against the hard granite, a laboratory for Borglum's models and calculations, changing rooms and washing facilities for the workers. The installation of these facilities on a remote mountain in the Black Hills in the 1920s and 30s, when such infrastructure was not easily come by, was itself a significant achievement. Workers reached the carving surfaces by climbing 700 steps from the base of the mountain to the top, then descending in bosun's chairs, small wooden seats suspended from cables. This journey, made twice daily, in weather that ranged from blazing summer heat to winter ice, was itself physically demanding and not without danger. The cables and bosun's chairs were not always in perfect condition, and the mountain face offered numerous opportunities for accidents. What is remarkable, given the scale of the project and the working conditions, is that no worker died during the construction of Mount Rushmore. This was not the result of exceptionally careful safety practices. By modern standards, the safety conditions were quite primitive, but rather the result of some combination of luck, worker experience and skill, and perhaps Borglum's own attention to the welfare of the people doing the most dangerous work. The carving proceeded across 14 seasons, from 1927 to 1941, with work stopping during winter months when temperatures made outdoor carving impossible and when funding frequently ran short. During the worst years of the Great Depression, when congressional appropriations dried up and private fundraising was nearly impossible, work halted entirely for extended periods, leaving the faces in various states of incompleteness, draped in nothing but South Dakota weather. The technical process from the first blasting of Washington's face in October 1927 to the last finishing work on Lincoln's face in October 1941 involved the removal of approximately 450,000 tons of granite from the mountain. The work required some 800 workers over the project's span, consumed years of effort, and cost approximately $1 million in 1930s money, a sum that would represent something like $15 to $20 million in current purchasing power, and a sum that was extraordinarily difficult to raise through the political and economic challenges of the Depression era. The result of this extraordinary effort is what we see today. 4 faces, each 60 feet tall, carved with sufficient precision that their subjects are immediately recognizable from viewing areas a quarter-mile away, preserved in granite hard enough to outlast civilization itself. The technical achievement is as remarkable as the artistic one, and the two cannot be separated. The artistry was only possible because of the technical problem-solving. The technical work was only worthwhile because of the artistic vision that guided it. The workers who climbed those 700 steps each morning, who hung in their bosun's chairs above hundreds of feet of empty air, who drilled and blasted and chiseled through 14 seasons of South Dakota weather, are the largely forgotten heroes of Mount Rushmore's creation. Their names appear in lists and crew photographs, but they have not received the sustained biographical attention given to Borglum himself or to the presidents whose faces they carved. They were working men, most of them from western South Dakota, many of them former miners and ranchers who had skills with hard rock and outdoor work that translated to the Rushmore environment. They were hired because they could do the physical work, not because they had artistic training. The artistry was Borglum's domain. The workers were his instruments, the human tools by which his vision was translated into stone. Their average wages were approximately 50 cents to 75 cents an hour during the early years, rising somewhat as the project continued. In the depths of the Great Depression, when tens of millions of Americans were unemployed, Rushmore jobs were desperately sought, offering not just wages, but the dignity of meaningful work and the pride of participation in something historic. Men traveled from considerable distances to apply for positions, and the waiting list was long. The daily physical demands were severe. Workers spent their working days hanging in bosun's chairs against the mountain face, their bodies pressed against stone or suspended in open air, their tools vibrating in their hands as the drills bit into the granite. The noise was constant and overwhelming. The stone dust, despite the wet drilling techniques developed to control it, was pervasive, settling on skin and in lungs. The temperatures ranged from scorching in summer to dangerously cold in winter. One of the most experienced and respected workers was Norman "Happy" Anderson, who worked at Rushmore for most of the project's duration and whose memoir provides some of the most vivid first-hand accounts of the construction experience. Anderson described both the physical hardships and the strange beauty of the work, hanging hundreds of feet over the valley in his chair, looking out over the black hills as the sun set, watching the developing faces emerge from the stone as the years of work accumulated.
The bosun's chair was a simple device, a wooden plank suspended by two cables, connected to a winch-operated main cable that allowed the worker to be raised or lowered by a winch operator at the mountain summit. The worker in the chair communicated with the top through a system of hand signals, directing the winch operator to move them up, down, or sideways to access different parts of the face. Coordination between the worker and the winch operator required trust and experience. A winch operator who misread a signal could move the worker into a dangerous position or lower them too quickly. Workers learned to read the particular habits and tendencies of different winch operators, developing working relationships built on mutual familiarity with the other's communication style. Falls occurred, though none proved fatal. Men whose harnesses failed or whose chairs suddenly dropped experienced moments of terror before safety systems, backup cables, lower catch rumps arrested their descent. Rocks falling from the mountain face above were a constant hazard, and workers learned to keep one eye always alert for falling debris. The crack of suddenly released rock, the shower of granite chips from a blast that scattered further than calculated, the dangerous conditions created by ice and wind in winter. All of these created an environment where vigilance was not optional but essential for survival. One of the workers' recurring challenges was the physical demand of the 700-step climb that began each working day. The steps were rough and steep, cut into the mountain, unprotected from weather. In summer, the climb was hot and sweaty. In early spring and late fall, it might be made in temperatures below freezing on steps that could be icy. The round trip twice daily added significant physical cost to the already demanding work on the face. The workers developed their own community, their own culture, their own hierarchy of respect based on skill, courage, and reliability. The most skilled drillers were valued for their ability to coax fine work from the hard granite, for their ability to work close to finished surfaces without damaging them. The bravest workers, those willing to take the most exposed positions or work in the most challenging conditions, earned a particular respect. And the most experienced workers became informal teachers for newcomers, transmitting the accumulated practical knowledge of the project. Borglum's relationship with his workers was characteristically complex. He could be generous, personally intervening to secure wages during periods when funding was short, defending workers who had been injured, taking personal interest in the welfare of men he considered particularly skilled. He could also be demanding, impatient, and dismissive of complaints about working conditions. He expected the same dedication to the project that he himself brought, and he was not always understanding of the difference between his own motivated commitment and the hired labor of men who had families to support and physical limits to their endurance. Several workers had particularly close relationships with Borglum. His foreman, Gus Sherberg, managed the daily operations of the construction with competence and loyalty that earned him Borglum's trust, if not always his patience. The official superintendent of carving, Luigi Del Bianco, an Italian-born stone carver whom Borglum brought in for the most skilled work, was responsible for much of the finest detail on the faces, particularly Lincoln's features, which Del Bianco reportedly worked on with particular care. Del Bianco's contribution to Mount Rushmore is a story of both achievement and recognition long delayed. He was brought to the project specifically for his exceptional skill with granite, skills honed in the Italian stone carving tradition, and he contributed detail work that is arguably the most technically challenging and artistically significant of the entire project. His family's campaign to secure formal recognition for his contributions decades after his death eventually succeeded when the National Park Service formally acknowledged his role in 2018. The workers' stories collectively represent a chapter in American labor history that deserves more attention than it typically has received. These were working-class men, most of them without formal education beyond high school, if that, who spent years of their working lives contributing to a monument of national significance. Their skills, their courage, their endurance, and their craftsmanship are embedded in every face on the mountain, inseparable from Borglum's artistic vision, essential to the achievement it produced. When visitors stand before Mount Rushmore today and look up at those 60-foot faces, they are seeing Borglum's vision, but they are also seeing the work of Norman Happy Anderson's drill, of Luigi Del Bianco's chisel, of hundreds of workers whose names are recorded in crew lists but who have not received the biographical attention their contributions warrant. The mountain holds their work as surely as it holds the images of the presidents. Their labor, compressed into stone, will endure for geological ages. The story of the Lakota Sioux and Mount Rushmore is a story that exists in permanent tension with the story of the memorial's creation and its celebration as a national monument. It is a story of broken promises, of legal violations, of cultural dispossession, and of ongoing resistance that refuses to be silenced by the simple fact of the monument's physical presence in the Black Hills. The relationship between the United States government and the Lakota Sioux in the 19th century is one of the most thoroughly documented cases of treaty violation and forced dispossession in American history. It is not a contested history in the sense of being disputed by serious historians. The facts are clear, the legal record is explicit, and the Supreme Court of the United States has ruled definitively that the taking of the Black Hills was illegal under American law. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 was not the first treaty between the United States and the Lakota, but it was the most comprehensive and the most binding. Signed at the conclusion of Red Cloud's War, a military conflict in which the Lakota, Arapaho, and Northern Cheyenne had successfully forced the abandonment of the Bozeman Trail forts, the treaty reflected a moment when the United States had been compelled to negotiate seriously rather than simply impose terms. The treaty established the Great Sioux Reservation, a large territory encompassing the western half of what is now South Dakota, including the Black Hills. It guaranteed that this land would be Lakota territory forever, that no secession of any portion of the reservation would be valid unless agreed to by 3/4 of adult male Lakota. It prohibited unauthorized settlement on the reservation. It made explicit promises of education, agricultural assistance, and other support to the transition to reservation life that the treaty anticipated. The treaty was, by the standards of 19th century American Indian policy, relatively favorable to the Lakota. Red Cloud and other Lakota leaders signed it with the understanding that their rights to the Black Hills and other reservation lands were permanently secured. The promises made were specific and legally binding. The violation of the treaty began incrementally and accelerated dramatically with Custer's 1874 expedition.
When gold was confirmed in the Black Hills, the pressure from prospectors and from the mining interests that backed them became impossible for the federal government to resist, regardless of treaty obligations. The government made nominal attempts to purchase the Black Hills, but the Lakota were unwilling to sell, and the 3/4 consent requirement of the treaty made any forced secession legally problematic. The government's solution was to use military action against Lakota groups that had not come to the reservations, designating them hostile and launching military campaigns that eventually forced the surrender of the last resistant groups after the Battle of the Little Bighorn and its aftermath. The Black Hills were then formally taken by an 1877 Act of Congress that was passed without the 3/4 consent of adult male Lakota and was therefore in violation of the treaty.
The legal consequences of this violation played out over more than a century. The Lakota Sioux Nation filed claims against the United States government beginning in the 1920s, pursuing the case through the Claims Court and eventually to the Supreme Court. In 1980, the Supreme Court ruled in United States versus Sioux Nation of Indians that the Black Hills had been taken illegally and that the Lakota were entitled to compensation. The court awarded $17.5 million in direct compensation, plus $105 million in interest that had accumulated since the original award was made in the 1970s. The Lakota refused the money. The Sioux Nation's response to the Supreme Court ruling and to the hundreds of millions of dollars that have since accumulated in a trust fund has been consistent. Money is not the point. The Black Hills are not for sale. The Lakota want the return of the land, or at least of the federal lands within the original treaty territory that have not been transferred to private ownership. This position has been maintained across generations, across changing political circumstances, across enormous economic pressure. The trust fund now exceeds $1 billion. Accepting it would provide resources that could transform living conditions on the Lakota reservations, where poverty rates are among the highest in the nation. But accepting the money would be understood as accepting the legitimacy of the Black Hills taking, as abandoning the claim to the land itself. The Lakota have not been willing to make that exchange. Against this background, the carving of 4 American presidential faces into the granite of the Black Hills takes on a different quality than it has in the standard narrative of American achievement and patriotism. From a Lakota perspective, Mount Rushmore was built on stolen land, on land taken in violation of a solemn treaty, on land that holds spiritual significance that cannot be measured in dollars or compensated with monuments to the civilization that took it. The presidents whose faces appear on the mountain have their own relationships to the Lakota story. Washington's presidency predated the major conflicts with the Lakota, but the policies of Euro-American expansion that led to those conflicts began in his era. Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase opened the West to the expansion that would ultimately dispossess the Lakota and other Plains nations. Lincoln, who preserved the Union and abolished slavery, was simultaneously the president who ordered the largest mass execution in American history, the hanging of 38 Dakota Sioux men following the Dakota War of 1862. Theodore Roosevelt's conservation policies, which created the national forests and parks that preserved Western landscapes, operated on the assumption that those landscapes belonged to the American nation rather than to the indigenous peoples who had inhabited them. Contemporary Native American perspectives on Mount Rushmore range from acceptance or indifference to profound objection. Some Lakota community members have made peace with the memorial as a fact of history, recognizing that it is not going to be removed and focusing their energy on other aspects of cultural preservation and political rights. Others maintain that the memorial is a constant reminder of dispossession, a monument built on land that was stolen, honoring men who were complicit in that stealing. Protests at the memorial have recurred throughout its history.
most notably during the American Indian Movement's period of activism in the 1970s, when activists occupied the mountain to draw attention to ongoing violations of treaty rights. More recently, conversations about the memorial have been shaped by broader reckonings with American monuments and the histories they embody. The National Park Service, which administers the memorial, has worked to include Lakota perspectives in interpretive materials, to acknowledge the contested history of the Black Hills, and to consult with Lakota communities about how their history and relationship to the land is represented at the site. These efforts have been appreciated by some and criticized as insufficient by others. The question of what should be done about Mount Rushmore, whether it should be preserved as is, modified to include indigenous perspectives, returned to Lakota jurisdiction, or something else entirely, does not have an easy answer. The memorial is both a remarkable human achievement and a monument built on a foundation of injustice. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and the tension between them cannot be dissolved by choosing one over the other. What the Lakota story demands, at minimum, is that the memorial not be understood in isolation, not be celebrated without acknowledgement of the land's history and the people who were displaced. It demands that the story told at Mount Rushmore be a complete story, one that includes the price paid for the expansion and power that the presidential faces represent. And it demands that the ongoing claims of the Lakota to the Black Hills be taken seriously as legal and moral matters, rather than treated as historical curiosities. Gutzon Borglum's vision for Mount Rushmore extended far beyond the 4 carved faces that would become the memorial's public face. He imagined a monument of extraordinary complexity, one that would serve not just as a tribute to 4 presidents, but as a lasting record of American civilization, its documents, its history, its physical extent as a nation. Central to this grander vision was a repository he called the Hall of Records, a chamber carved into the mountain itself that would hold the essential records of American history and culture. Borglum described the Hall of Records in terms that made his ambitions for the memorial clear. He wanted to create something that future civilizations, even civilizations thousands of years in the future, civilizations that might not speak any current human language, would be able to access and understand. He was thinking about communication across enormous stretches of time, about creating a message that would survive not just the normal erosion of institutional memory, but the kind of civilizational discontinuity that had swallowed earlier great cultures. The plans for the Hall of Records were elaborate and ever-changing, as Borglum's plans tended to be. In their most ambitious form, they included an entryway flanked by 18-foot carved eagles leading to a massive chamber 800 feet into the mountain. Within this chamber, a repository would hold complete records of American history and culture. The walls would be inscribed with the history of the United States in multiple languages, including Braille. A gilded bronze eagle with a 40-foot wingspan would hang from the ceiling. The funding and logistical challenges that constrained the main carving project limited work on the Hall of Records. Borglum managed to begin excavation of the entrance tunnel in the 1930s, but work was repeatedly halted by funding shortfalls and by the priority given to completing the presidential faces. When Borglum died in 1941, the Hall of Records was little more than a roughly excavated tunnel, the ambitious interior plans unrealized. The idea did not die entirely. In 1998, Borglum's vision was partially realized in a modest but poignant way. A repository was carved out of the Hall of Records entrance and filled with a set of porcelain enamel panels containing the texts of major founding documents, biographies of the 4 presidents, a history of how Mount Rushmore was carved, and a description of the United States as of 1998. These panels were enclosed in a teak box placed within a titanium vault sealed with a granite capstone. The placement of this repository fulfilled a reduced version of Borglum's original intention, a record of American civilization preserved in the granite of the Black Hills, intended to communicate across centuries or millennia to whoever might find and read it. The documents chosen for preservation reflect the same particular American self-understanding that the presidential faces embody. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, records of the president's lives, and the carving project. The Hall of Records, as actually realized, is not accessible to visitors, sealed beneath the granite capstone in its teak box and titanium vault. It is there, present within the mountain, a time capsule of sorts, a message addressed to the future. Whether the future it was intended for, a civilization capable of reading the English text on the enamel panels, will actually come to pass, or whether the vault's contents will someday be found by people who must struggle to decipher them, as we struggle to decipher ancient inscriptions, is unknowable.
The concept of the Hall of Records reflects something important about Borglum's understanding of the project. He was not simply making a monument for contemporary Americans or for the next generation. He was making a statement addressed to deep time, an assertion that what had been created here, this democratic civilization that had produced Washington and Jefferson and Lincoln and Roosevelt, was worth remembering across the ages, worth going to extraordinary lengths to preserve and communicate. Whether that assertion is ultimately justified depends on what this civilization does with itself in the years and centuries ahead. The granite will hold its record. The enamel panels will preserve their text. The faces will weather slowly, their features gradually softening over the millennia, becoming harder and harder to recognize as the men they represent, and eventually becoming simply the residue of carved work, suggestions of human faces in ancient stone. What the civilization that carved them becomes, whether it fulfills the ideals those faces represent or falls short of them, is not something the mountain can determine. That is the work of the living. From the moment the first blasted granite tumbled down the mountainside, Mount Rushmore began accumulating cultural significance that extended well beyond its official status as a national memorial. It entered the imagination of the nation and the world with a speed and completeness that few monuments achieve, becoming within decades of its completion one of the most recognizable human-made structures on Earth. The memorial's cinematic career began almost simultaneously with its construction. Alfred Hitchcock's 1959 film North by Northwest made Mount Rushmore its climactic setting, with Cary Grant and Eva Marie Saint fleeing enemy agents across the stone faces of the presidents in a sequence that combined the memorial's grandeur with genuine physical danger. Hitchcock's use of the location was masterful. He understood that the faces' inhuman scale and their peculiar expression of national gravitas would amplify the thriller's themes about identity, deception, and American innocence confronting darker forces. North by Northwest was not the first film to use Mount Rushmore as a setting, and it would not be the last. The memorial has appeared in dozens of films and television productions, its image serving variously as a symbol of patriotism, of American power, of the gap between national ideals and national realities, and occasionally of absurdity, as in several comedic treatments that have used the stone president's solemn expressions as contrast for ridiculous situations. In literature, Mount Rushmore has served similar purposes. It appears as a symbol in political essays and historical analyses, as a setting in novels ranging from thrillers to children's books, as a subject for poetry that ranges from celebratory to critical. The memorial's combination of physical grandeur and symbolic weight makes it a natural point of reference for writers thinking about American identity, about the relationship between history and mythology, about the permanence or impermanence of the ideals that the carved faces represent.
Advertising discovered Mount Rushmore early and has never stopped using it. The 4 presidential faces have appeared in advertisements for everything from candy to automobiles, their presence lending products a borrowed authority, a suggestion that whatever is being sold partakes somehow of presidential greatness or national significance. This commercial use has both reflected and contributed to the memorial's cultural ubiquitousness, making the image familiar to people who have never visited and would not necessarily identify themselves as particularly interested in presidential history or South Dakota tourism. The tourism that Mount Rushmore generates is one of the most significant economic factors in South Dakota's state economy. Approximately 2 to 3 million visitors arrive annually, and their spending supports not just the immediate communities around Keystone and Hill City, but businesses throughout the Black Hills region and beyond. Hotels, restaurants, souvenir shops, tour operators, and the full infrastructure of the American tourist economy have grown up around the memorial. The visitor experience has been shaped by successive generations of planning and development at the site. The original facilities were minimal, a parking area and a basic view path. Over the decades, more elaborate visitor infrastructure has been added, including a visitor center designed by renowned architect Lawrence Halprin, the Avenue of Flags featuring flags of all 50 states, the presidential trail that leads closer to the base of the mountain, an amphitheater for evening programs, and extensive interpretive displays about the construction, the presidents, and the history of the Black Hills. The evening lighting ceremony, which illuminates the faces with carefully positioned lights after dark, has become one of the memorial's most popular experiences. The ceremony includes a program of narration and music and concludes with the flags being lowered by veterans in a ceremony that adds an element of living patriotic tradition to the static presence of the monument. Seeing the faces illuminated against a dark sky, the granite glowing with artificial light while the surrounding pines fade into blackness, creates a different impression than daylight viewing. More theatrical, more deliberately imposing, more explicitly claiming the emotional territory of national reverence. The memorial's status as a symbol has made it a recurring focus of political statement and debate. Presidents visit to associate themselves with the presidents immortalized there, and the political meaning of such visits is always carefully managed. Protests at the memorial have made it a forum for statements about national policy, Native American rights, and the nature of American democracy. The memorial's own presence in public discourse is a measure of its success as a symbol. It means something, provokes responses, generates debate, serves as a reference point for ongoing conversations about what America is and what it should be. The souvenir industry around Mount Rushmore deserves a moment of attention as a phenomenon in itself. The memorial's image appears on items ranging from the predictable t-shirts, postcards, mugs, to the extraordinarily specific and occasionally bizarre. Snow globes, refrigerator magnets, rubber tomahawks, Mount Rushmore-shaped chocolates, Mount Rushmore-themed golf balls. The range of objects bearing the memorial's image is a testament to American commercial creativity and to the memorial's status as a genuinely iconic image. The souvenir industry itself has become part of the Mount Rushmore story, a demonstration of how thoroughly the memorial has penetrated American popular culture. The granite of Mount Rushmore, ancient and durable though it is not impervious to the effects of weather, time, and the physical stresses that all stone faces. The preservation of the memorial, ensuring that the carved faces remain recognizable and structurally sound across the centuries, is a significant ongoing challenge that requires sophisticated geological monitoring, careful maintenance, and occasional intervention. The primary natural threat to the memorial is water. Water is the universal solvent, the agent that more than any other shapes and eventually destroys stone. At Rushmore, water threatens in several ways. It enters cracks in the granite, and when temperatures drop below freezing, it expands as it freezes, forcing the cracks wider. This freeze-thaw cycle, operating across many winters, progressively widens natural joints in the stone and can eventually cause significant fracturing or even block falls. The Harney Peak granite of Mount Rushmore is particularly subject to crack formation because of its mineral composition. As granite weathers, the feldspar minerals that constitute a major component of the rock decompose to clay minerals. This decomposition, though slow, weakens the cement that holds the granite grains together and occurs preferentially along existing fractures and at grain boundaries. Over geological time, this process progressively weakens even very hard granite. Water also enters the carved surfaces themselves through hairline cracks that are invisible to the naked eye but significant at the scale of water infiltration. Once inside these micro cracks, water can mobilize mineral salts that deposit on the surface as the water evaporates, creating stresses as the salt crystals grow. These stresses, applied repeatedly over many cycles of wetting and drying, can eventually cause surface spalling, the flaking off of thin sheets of rock from the carved face.
The monitoring program at Mount Rushmore uses a variety of instruments to track the condition of the stone. Crack meters measure any change in the width of visible fractures, detecting even sub-millimeter changes that might indicate movement. Temperature sensors track the freezing and thawing cycles that stress the rock. Water infiltration is measured through boreholes drilled at strategic locations. Photographic monitoring documents any visible changes in surface condition over time. The most significant structural concern identified through this monitoring is a large crack running behind and somewhat parallel to Lincoln's face. This crack, which penetrates deeply into the mountain, represents a potential structural failure point if water infiltration and freeze-thaw cycling progressively widened it. The National Park Service addressed this concern through a major injection grouting project, filling the crack with a specialized grout that seals it against water infiltration while providing structural reinforcement. Other preservation interventions have included sealing smaller cracks and joints in the carved surfaces, treating water-stained areas to prevent salt crystallization, and monitoring for any biological growth, mosses, lichens, that might accelerate weathering. The biological growth question is particularly complex because some growth provides actual protection against erosion, while other growth accelerates weathering through root penetration and chemical action. The carved surfaces are periodically cleaned to remove staining and biological growth, using carefully selected treatments that are effective against the target material without affecting the underlying granite. This cleaning reveals details in the carving that may have been obscured by accumulation of organic material and mineral staining, and it also allows close examination of the surface condition to detect any developing problems before they become serious. Climate change presents a newer and less fully understood set of challenges for the memorial's preservation. Changes in precipitation patterns affect the moisture regime that drives weathering processes. Rising temperatures alter the freeze-thaw cycle that is one of the primary mechanisms of physical weathering. More intense precipitation events increase the risk of rapid water infiltration and flash flooding. The specific implications of these changes for the long-term condition of the carved faces are being studied, but the general trend is toward increased weathering stress in a changing climate. The granite itself is expected to maintain fine detail in the carved faces for thousands to tens of thousands of years under current conditions, based on the weathering rates measured for exposed granite surfaces in similar climatic conditions. The eyes, the most deeply recessed features on each face, are among the most protected from direct weathering and are expected to remain recognizable longest. Surface details like the precise modeling of the lips or the texture of the hair representations will weather faster than the major structural features. The long-term vision for the memorial's preservation involves not just maintenance of the current condition, but adaptation to changing conditions, the development of new techniques and materials as the science of stone conservation advances, and the training of successive generations of conservators who will take responsibility for the memorial's condition when their predecessors retire. This represents a commitment not just to the present, but to the future, a recognition that the responsibility for maintaining what Borglum's workers created extends forward in time as far as the carved faces themselves. Mount Rushmore exists in the 21st century as both a beloved national monument and an ongoing controversy, a place where multiple, sometimes incompatible stories about American history and identity converge. The debates surrounding the memorial have intensified in recent years as national conversations about monuments, memory, and representation have grown more searching and less willing to accept inherited narratives uncritically.
The most persistent and fundamental controversy concerns the memorial's relationship to the Black Hills and to the Lakota Sioux people for whom those hills are sacred. This controversy did not begin in the 21st century. It has been present since before the first dynamite blast on Washington's face. But it has gained wider attention as indigenous rights have moved closer to the center of national conversation. The Lakota position has remained consistent. The Black Hills were taken in violation of the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. The Supreme Court has confirmed this violation, and the question is not resolved by the carving of presidential faces into the stolen land. Every year, on the date of Borglum's first blast on Washington's face, the Lakota observe a day of mourning and protest. Organizations like the Crazy Horse Memorial Project, begun in 1948 by Korzak Ziolkowski at the request of Oglala Lakota Chief Henry Standing Bear, represent an assertion of Native presence and pride in the Black Hills that stands in deliberate counterpoint to Mount Rushmore. The Crazy Horse Memorial, still under construction in the Black Hills not far from Mount Rushmore, will, when completed, be a figure of Crazy Horse, the Oglala Lakota leader, carved into a mountain on a scale that will dwarf Rushmore. It is not a government project, but a private one, funded by admissions fees and donations, proceeding slowly because of the commitment to private rather than government funding. Its existence represents both a response to Rushmore and an independent assertion of the Lakota claim to permanent presence in the Black Hills. Proposals to modify Mount Rushmore to include additional figures or to add Native American representation have been made periodically and have not found consensus. Some proposals have suggested adding Susan B. Anthony, who campaigned for women's suffrage, to the memorial. Others have proposed Native leaders, other presidents, or symbolic figures. The National Park Service has generally opposed additions, arguing that they would violate the artistic integrity of Borglum's composition and that the memorial should be understood in its historical context rather than modified to reflect contemporary values. The summer of 2020 brought Mount Rushmore to the center of national debate about monuments and their meanings. Presidential rallies at the memorial, debates about its future, calls for both its protection and its removal. The memorial became a focal point for broader arguments about how Americans should relate to their national symbols, about which histories deserve celebration and which deserve critique, about the relationship between achievement and context, about whether great accomplishments can or should be honored separately from the injustices that accompanied them. What is important to recognize is that these debates are not a threat to the memorial, but an expression of the democratic values it ostensibly represents. A democracy that cannot critically examine its own memorials has stopped being fully democratic. The capacity for self-examination, for holding multiple truths simultaneously, for honoring achievement while acknowledging injustice, these are democratic capacities that Mount Rushmore, if it is functioning properly as a national symbol, should stimulate rather than suppress. The Native American communities whose sacred land was taken to create the memorial deserve to have their perspective included not as a marginal note, but as a central element of the memorial's interpretation. The workers whose labor created the faces deserve recognition alongside the sculptor and the presidents they carved. The debates about who should be on the mountain and about what it means that these particular men were chosen deserve to be taken seriously as genuine questions about American values rather than dismissed as attacks on heritage. Mount Rushmore does not need to be defended against these questions. It is secure enough in granite. What it needs is the kind of honest, complex, multi-voiced interpretation that does justice to the full story of its creation, meaning, and its contested place in American life.
The sun descends toward the western horizon over the Black Hills, and the quality of light at Mount Rushmore changes in ways that reveal new aspects of the carved faces. The long shadows of late afternoon create dramatic modeling in the stone, emphasizing the depth of the carving in ways that flatter midday light cannot. Washington's nose casts a shadow across his right cheek. The deep carved eyes of all four presidents become more prominent, receding further into shadow while their brows and cheekbones catch the last horizontal rays.
Visitors who have spent the day at the memorial, moving between the various viewing points on the Presidential Trail, consulting the interpretive displays in the visitor center, perhaps attending a ranger-led program, or walking the grounds of the sculptor's studio where Borglum's models and tools are preserved, begin to gather at the main amphitheater for the evening lighting ceremony. They come with folding chairs, with blankets against the cooling mountain air, with children who have been promised something special after a long day of standing and looking. The ceremony begins at dusk as the natural light fails and the faces begin to fade from the color of granite to the gray of shadows. The narration that accompanies the lighting ceremony speaks of the presidents honored there, of the construction story, of the ideals of democracy and freedom that the memorial is intended to represent. The words are familiar, the rhetoric of patriotic commemoration, sincere in their devotion to the memorial's official meaning, even as they leave unspoken the more complicated dimensions of the story. Then the lights come on. The faces are revealed in the darkness with a clarity and a drama that the most perfect midday light cannot match. Each face is illuminated from below and from the sides, creating a theatrical presentation that emphasizes the sculpture's intentionality, its human creation, its status as a work of art meant to be seen and interpreted. In daylight, the faces can seem like a natural feature of the mountain, so large and so integrated into the granite that they might almost be an accident of geology. At night, lit from below, they are unmistakably made, unmistakably intentional, unmistakably the expression of a human will to make meaning from stone. The ceremony concludes with the flags being lowered by veterans in a moment of quiet ceremony that adds human scale and living continuity to the static presence of the carved stone. Veterans of different ages, different wars, different eras of American history participate, their service connecting the present generation to the long narrative of the nation that the memorial represents. For many visitors, this moment is the most moving of the day, the point at which the abstract idea of national memory becomes concrete in the persons of real human beings whose lives have been shaped by the country those faces represent. After the ceremony, as the crowd disperses and the parking lots empty, the faces remain illuminated for a time, visible for miles across the Black Hills. Driving away, looking back through the rear window, you can see them in the darkness. 4 old men in granite, looking out from their mountain toward a horizon they cannot see, holding their expressions against the centuries, patient in the way that only stone can be patient. The monument's meaning is not fixed. It cannot be fixed, any more than the meaning of the nation it represents can be fixed. Washington's face carries different meanings for different people. For some, the embodiment of civic virtue and sacrifice. For others, the face of a slaveholder whose freedom was built on the unfreedom of others. Jefferson means the Declaration and the Louisiana Purchase, and also Sally Hemings and the forced removal of indigenous peoples. Lincoln means the Union preserved and slavery abolished, and also the Lakota Sioux executions and the incomplete project of Reconstruction. Roosevelt means conservation and the Panama Canal, and also the Rough Rider imperialism and the racial attitudes that shaped his policies. All of these meanings are true. None of them is the whole truth. The faces in the granite hold them all simultaneously, saying nothing, patient and silent, allowing each generation of visitors to bring its own understanding, its own questions, its own moral reckoning to the conversation.
This is what monuments do at their best. They are not answers, but provocations, not conclusions, but beginnings, not the final word on historical meaning, but a durable point of reference around which the ongoing debate about meaning can organize itself. Mount Rushmore has been fulfilling this function for nearly a century, and the granite will allow it to continue doing so for time periods that make a century seem brief.
The stone is older than life itself. The faces carved into it are young by comparison, barely formed in geological terms, their features still sharp with detail that will only slowly weather over the millennia. They will outlast the language in which this description is written. They will outlast the political structures that created them and that they are meant to represent. They will become, eventually, archaeological remains, studied by whatever civilization comes after ours with the same patient curiosity that we apply to the ruins of earlier civilizations. What will those future archaeologists make of four faces in a mountain in the Black Hills of what was once called South Dakota? They will recognize them as human faces, presumably. They will understand them as intentional, as made things expressing some human purpose. Whether they will be able to identify the subjects, to understand the political and historical context, to grasp the ideals that Gutzon Borglum believed he was carving into eternity, this depends entirely on what records survive, what interpretive information endures alongside the faces themselves. Borglum's Hall of Records, sealed in its teak box and titanium vault beneath the granite capstone, will be there if the future archaeologists think to look. The enamel panels with their texts of the founding documents, their biographies of the presidents, their account of the carving project, these may survive to tell the story to whoever finds them, if they can decipher the language and the context. But even if the texts are lost, even if language itself has shifted beyond recognition, something will remain. Four human faces carved into stone, looking outward with expressions that hold the full range of human experience, the responsibility and vision and complexity and contradiction of the men they represent, the ambition and artistry and labor of the people who carved them, the hope and the injustice and the debate and the endurance of the nation that created them. They will ask their silent questions to the future as they ask them to the present. What does it mean to be great? What does it mean to be free? What does it cost to build something that lasts? And who gets to decide what is remembered in stone? These questions have no final answers. They are asked again and differently by every generation that stands before the mountain and looks up at the faces in the granite. This is the monument's deepest purpose, not to answer these questions, but to keep them alive, to preserve them in stone against the erosion of time and the tendency of comfortable certainty, to ensure that they are still being asked when the immediate context that generated them has been long forgotten. The Black Hills are dark now, the pines merging into shadow, the sky above them filling with stars. The faces on the mountain are lit from below, four old men looking out over the darkness, over the history that made them and that they helped to make, over the ongoing, unfinished, magnificent, deeply flawed, still striving experiment in democratic self-governance that they are meant to represent. They have been here for less than a century. The stone beneath their faces has been here for 1.6 billion years. And the questions they ask will be asked for as long as there are people to ask them. The mountain endures. The conversation continues.